everyone, welcome to a new episode of Crafting with Cosplay Fabrics. My name is Indra and today I'm going to show you some troubleshooting tips on hemming stretch and non-stretch fabrics. Okay, so I wanted to show you how to hem different types of fabrics. So I figured to just kind of narrow it down to just stretch and non-stretch fabrics. And for this I'm using the Mermaid Oil Slick and the Dual Fantasy du Peony, both from the JoAnn collection. I find that these two fabrics are the ones that people ask me the most about, especially when it comes to hemming. Anything that has like a foil and anything that frays easily. So I figured why not show you with these two fabrics. So as you can see, I've gone ahead and cut out the Dual Fantasy in a circular sort of way. And that is because I find that when people do, for example, circle skirts, or they work with hems that have to do with doing bias, like sewing on the bias, sometimes the hems almost look like they're curling or like rolling a little bit. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. And then the other hemming issue is when it comes to like oil slicks, foils and stuff like that, and stretch fabrics, is that people sometimes tell me that they feel like the fabric catches, or they have a lot of trouble because they don't want to use pins, because like straight pins, because it creates like tiny little holes on the fabric, and using like clips or anything like that is a little too bulky for such a thin fabric. So I'm going to show you a few things on how to troubleshoot these little issues. So first I want to start with the non-stretch fabric. As I said, this is the Dual Fantasy du Peony. And the two things that I want to show you is, first, when it comes to any fabrics that fray, I know I've talked about this in previous videos, is to immediately go ahead and work the edge. You can either zigzag the edges, or you can use your serger, if whatever machine you prefer to use. So once that is done, then there's two methods that I like to use when it comes to hemming. So we'll say that the rounded part is the hem, and first then it would be to finish off the edge, like I said, and pressing the fabric. That way everything is nice and flat. So one of the methods that I like is to sew right on like the amount that I want to sort of fold over and sew. So I'm just going to do just a straight stitch, like right where I want to do that, and I'll show you in my machine. And the other method is I like to cut a separate fabric. You can also do this with bias tape, but I personally like to just use the same fabric. And what I do is basically just do like a copy of that curve with just like a, wider, like a little bit of a wide band. That way I can still like either fold it over, or what I like to do is just serge it and then sew it together, flip it over, and then sew. So I'm gonna go ahead and do these in my machine, and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so I went ahead and did the edges for my non-stretch fabric, and all I did was just use my serger. So now what I'm going to do is on the, well, it doesn't matter at this point on the right or wrong side, but I'm going to do the straight stitch like right on the size of the hem that I want to create. So for this I'm just going to use just a regular length straight stitch, and what I like to do often with my hems is I like to just use my foot as a guide. So I'll just try to put this edge against like the edge of the foot. So I'll just try to guide it, and that way I'll get a straight stitch. So go ahead and do that, and make sure that when you're doing this you're also locking your stitches. So once you have that sewn, basically what you're doing is using that as a guide to sort of like flip it in right on the edge and then pinning it. And you want to pin across so that then you can just sew right over. So you'll see that this looks a little bit puckered right now. So the next step is going to be to press this and then sew it. Okay, so I've gone ahead and pressed it, and you can see it looks nice and flat now. You will notice that it does gather at the very bottom of this, because you have to remember that the reason why this happens is because you're basically using the larger part of this and flipping it over onto like a much smaller space. So there will be some gathering happening, but it won't pucker and it won't roll your hem or anything like that. So once you have it pressed, and I highly recommend using of course the temperature that your fabric can hold, but using the highest that your fabric can hold with lots of steam. So now we'll just go ahead and sew and then do the final ironing. Alright, and there you have it. Obviously take more time doing this. I'm just showing you an example when it comes to like your stitch, that way everything looks nice and even, but you can see that it turns out like actually really nice and flat, and it doesn't give you like these crazy looking like peaks. And you know, obviously use thread that matches your fabric and stuff like that, but I feel like that way I can show you that a color that will actually show up on the fabric and show you that this is a really smooth method that works. So the next method is the one where I cut that extra bias piece, and basically it's just matching the two right sides together and then flipping it over, steaming it or pressing it, ironing it, and sewing. So then all I'm gonna do is just flip it over and press it and sew it. And there you have it, nice, even and flat hem. I actually really love this technique. Obviously, you know, when you pay close attention to the width of like what you're doing, it turns out really, really, really nice. And I like that it adds a little bit more thickness to the hem as well. Okay, so for any type of foil, oil slick type fabric, the methods are a little bit similar than what I showed you before. You can basically fold over the fabric and sew it, but it is a little bit difficult with these types of fabrics if you're not pinning them. Most of the time, the problem lies in when you're sewing it, don't use a straight stitch. You want to use a zigzag. And when you use a zigzag, you want to sort of go right in the middle. So one stitch will be out here and one stitch will be in the fold. So definitely also try to experiment with how wide or how long your stitch is, as well as the tension, because that does play a part in a lot of the sewing. The other thing is, when you're sewing it, don't stretch it as you're sewing it. Otherwise, when you're done, you're gonna get a bit of like bumpy. It's not gonna be nice and flat. So what I like to do, the two methods that I like to do is either, if I'm not pinning, because obviously if I pin and sew, it works just as well. One of the methods is to use the double stick tape, and they sell, this one is about half an inch, like actually like 3/4 of an inch. And they also sell really, really small ones, like 1/4 inch, like thin ones. But I'm just gonna use this one so that you can just see. And basically you just glue it down, and this has a like a sticky side, and then it has like this sort of non-stick surface over it, and all you do is just peel it back and then fold it over. And then just like put it down. It looks actually really nice like this. However, I don't think this is a very strong hold. If you notice, it can like easily just like peel back. So it's just nice as a stabilizer, and then I would suggest to go in and zigzag. You can either zigzag at this point if you use this. You can use it like right on the edge versus sewing it like I told you before. And the other method is what I'm going to do just as before is sewing like right on the edge how much I want to fold over. However, because this is a stretch fabric, excuse me, you will have to use a very particular tension and a very particular stitch length for this. Otherwise, when you're sewing, you're gonna get like, it's gonna basically gather the fabric. What I find works best is if you use a really small tension and a really small stitch. So if you can, try to use like a little piece like this of the fabric just to experiment with the tension and stitch. That way you get something that is like completely flat and it won't like gather your fabric. So I'll go ahead and show you that in the machine. So here is the hem that I did with the double stick tape. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew that, and I will be using a zigzag stitch, and I'm gonna try to make it wide and a little bit longer, and my tension is relatively high, but definitely, like I said before, double check with your machine, like what you prefer to use. See, and there you have it, and it's flat and it doesn't pucker or anything. Okay, so for the other technique, I'm gonna do like what I did with the non-stretch fabric. So I'm gonna use a straight stitch right on the where I want the hem to be. Because this is a stretch fabric, you will have to make sure that you have the right tension and the right stitch length. I recommend tighter stitches and tighter tension. I find that that works the best for me. However, every machine is different, so do play around with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew that straight stitch, and then I'll fold it over right there and just kind of guide it through the machine like afterwards. Okay, so when you're sewing, by the way, you don't want to be pulling on the fabric. If you see that it starts to gather, then definitely play around a little bit more with the tension. So what I'm gonna do is now use this as a guide because this breaks up the thread, so it makes it really easy to just like fold it over if you cannot if you don't want to use pins, because I know that that creates little holes on this. So go slow, and if you find that your machine starts to skip stitches, then readjust the tension. So make sure that you're also playing around with the length and width of the zigzag. You will see that sometimes when the tension is a little bit tighter, it doesn't look totally like a zigzag. Like it almost looks like little diamond shapes. I'll show you that, but it'll keep you from skipping from having skipped stitches, and it'll also help with the actual stretch. So even if it doesn't look perfect, it'll work. It'll do what it's supposed to. So what I'm gonna do is just fold it over, and I'm going to try to sew it as close to the fold edge as possible, and if possible trying to get stitches one outside and one inside of the fold. And if you see that the fabric starts to like roll out a little bit, just readjust it and just keep guiding it through. If you need to, just lift the foot back up and readjust the fabric. Alright, and there you go. And that is what it looks like, and it's nice and flat. And it still like stretches the fabric really well. And it looks really nice and even. And at this point, if you would really want to, you can always pull that initial hem if you really want to get rid of it. If you stretch it a lot, it'll probably like break off because it is a straight stitch, but up to you. I find that this works. Usually hems are not the most stretched out part as compared to some of the other parts of like a garment. So yeah, and that's it. I know that these fabrics have very unique finishes to them, so there's a lot of like trial and error when it comes to them. But I do hope that this gives you a little bit of information on how to tackle some of these problems. But if you have any other questions or concerns, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. I hope that this helps you with your future costumes, and maybe if you've been wondering how to use some of these fabrics, maybe this will put some of your worries to rest. So I hope that you like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week for another tip, trick, or tutorial featuring Cosplay Fabrics. See ya!